This is Ritual 10, and we're discussing now a stage of our education that concerns ritual. And our whole technique is to understand that week by week, it's like taking a step. And as we align these steps together, we're able to observe that we're going in some kind of a direction, that our movement is not just a meandering, but that it has a purpose. It has what would be called in mathematics a vector. But we have learned in the previous section of our education, which was nature. Before ritual, there was nature. And we have learned in nature that existence always occurs in pairs, fundamentally. Just like there are protons, there need to be electrons as well as protons for there to be atoms. So all extant things, all objectivity is in pairs. So that whenever there's a vector, there's always another vector. There are always a pair of vectors. And in algebraic analysis, on the most introductory fundamental level, when you have two vectors, there is a resultant in between them that absorbs the median energy. It's called a tensor. It means if you have a 90-degree vector going straight up and a vector going off to the side, the resultant force will be, if those two vectors are equal, a 45-degree angle tensor. Only one vector is indicated in ritual. Ritual is concerned only with one vector, whereas the concern with both vectors is the province of symbols. So that symbols, which have to do with the objectivity of the mind, deal with the full force of what's going on. But the concern of ritual is not with the symbolic full force of what's going on, but with the vector that is most prominent, whichever that happens to be. So that ritual is keeping track of what you are doing step by step in an alignment that goes somewhere. And you're not concerned very much with all the alternatives, but simply with what is practically going on. And so ritual always has a practical tone to it. It has an exactness which eliminates the extraneous. Whereas very frequently, when we go into our mind, when we go into a symbolic understanding that's more complete, all the variations, all the variants are also interesting, are also important, must also be taken into consideration. Now, a very simple way of saying this, like a litmus test, ritual concerns itself with existence in its practicality, whereas symbols concern themselves with the entire spectrum in its theoretical completeness. So that symbols connotate to us a concern with the theory of things, whereas ritual connotates to us concern with the practicality. of things. And together we could pair them up in the famous phrase, theory and practice. That when someone is really together, they understand both the theory and the practice. So our whole first year of education concerns itself with this theory and practice, but we reverse the order because practice comes before theory. And we have a second year of education because theory has a transformative summation. Whereas practice, when practice is exact, that's it. It has a stop. It has a full stop to it. So that, for instance, when Basho writes a haiku in his Zen-like exactness, sometimes at the very end of the haiku, he will put a word, kiri, which doesn't translate. It doesn't mean anything. What it is, it's one of those kinds of cut words. Kiriji, they're called in Japanese. It's a cut word that's like it's like an interjection, like oh or ah or Kiri means final stop. It means that's it. Period. It means what we would say in American English in the 90s, ta-da, 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 period. The word period doesn't mean a period. It just, that's it. We don't say anymore. Kiri in Basho's haiku indicates that one gestures with language that that's it completely. That's the total stop. The essence of life does not stop with Kiri, but the substance of life stops with Kiri, as in the haiku. So that existence, being the substance of life, has a definite crispness, an exact thusness, which has always been characterized east and west by men and women as the practical that's it. And so the bottom line, as one would say, the bottom line of what's real has always been, east and west for men and women, whatever you come to be able to hold, that's it. But the substance of existence, even though it's a finality, even though it's a that's it, has a resonance when expressed. If one simply did an action, the action culminates in its occurrence. Two hands clapping. That's it. But what is the sound of one hand clapping? The Zen koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping, continues the resonance that language has, that if you speak of an action, if you speak of an event, if you add the mythic horizon of language to an action, there's a reverberation, there's a resonance that language introduces, and action now has a language resonance. And at the farthest reaches of that language resonance is some kind of symbolic essence, which is linked to the ritual substance of existence. And only if you're sensitized to the entire ecology of substance and essence in their reverberation together Only if one is sensitized to that wholeness would one be able to appreciate a poet like Basho. Now, we are talking today in Ritual 10 not only about Basho and Haiku, but we have learned to pair together. That if we use just a book, it's like an old-fashioned education that no longer works. 2,000 years ago, an education could be based on a book, and it was a new thing. The codex, which is the Greek word for book. In Latin, it's libros, but in Greek, it's codex. The form of the book, the codex, was made about 2,000 years ago for the first time. Before that, there were no codexes at all. They never existed. There were no books. Written language was always on scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The great library at Alexandria had 1 million scrolls and no books. Books came in about 2,000 years ago, and they were the archetype of a new kind of written language. And when the book came in as the archetype of a new written language, a whole link with scrolls of language was lost. The whole presentation of the way in which a written language on a scroll was at its time 2,000 years before 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, the introduction of the scroll was a great advance. In 2000 BC, the scroll was a form of putting language into a written and therefore a magical mode. And the magical mode of language is a visionary mode. A written language, in order to read a written language, you have to be able to make pictures in your mind. You cannot read words and have any meaning occur whatsoever unless those words make pictures in your mind, at least initially. But on the scroll, it was at such an early time that there were no minds capable of making pictures in their mind, and so the pictures were on the scroll. So the origins of writing were pictures on scrolls. Whether in Egypt or Samaria or in China, wherever it was, the Chinese characters were not words, they were pictographs. The Egyptian pictures were hieroglyphs. So that language in 2000 BC on the scroll, which was new at the time, was a pictorial presentation of a double vector, of a symbolic understanding of the tensor of the whole of the integrative process. Whereas in 0 BC, 2,000 years later, the scroll was transformed into the codex, into the book. And in the book, you don't put hieroglyphs, you don't put pictographs, but you put words. It meant that there was a transformation from the hieroglyph to the word. Why did they call Jesus the Word? They never called him the hieroglyph. The phrase, I am the Word of God, is not like a polite little parlor sentiment. It's a penetrative, symbolic reality expressing a new understanding, a new level of integration that had never been achieved before. Whereas in 2000 BC, the presentation of the first pictograph documents, the scroll. And a good example would be the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, 18th dynasty, comes out about 1900 BC. And for the first time, one sees like in the case of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the power of language, which is no longer kept on a mythic level, but is raised to a visionary level. And that visionary language has magical efficacy. When one speaks a magic language, it reframes, recuts, it transforms nature. It transforms the natural cycle by the introduction of a conscious arrangement. And so the scroll in 2000 BC, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead on its scroll, was a marked transformation. The book 2,000 years later was another transformation, a transformation into the codex of the scroll. And now, 2,000 years after that, in 2000 AD, the beginning of the 21st century, instead of using a single book, we use pairs of books, because the new form has not yet been available. The new form for the next 2,000 years is not available yet to use. So we have to use a kind of a construction crutch. It's only 1996. 200 years from now, there'll be a new form. No one will need books, not even pairs of books. Because this kind of education will have done its job. And in 10 generations, people won't need books anymore at all. Just like they don't need scrolls. Just like they don't need what was there before the scrolls. What was there before the scrolls? Before 2000 BC. What was the form of visionary language before 2000 BC? If you go to Egypt and you go to see the earliest pyramids are the last record of the cycle that began in 4000 BC and came to a conclusion in 2000 BC. And if you go to see the oldest pyramid is the Pyramid of Unas. If you go into the Pyramid of Unas, as soon as you get into the entrance, you see the hieroglyphics on the wall of the tomb, because the pyramid is a tomb. It's a geometrically shaped tomb. It's a visionary cutting of the natural stone into the geometric shape, the simplest shape that holds in nature. The very first shape in nature is a triangle. And in 3 dimensions, the very simplest shape is the pyramid. So it means the beginning of 3-dimensional shape from the projection of the magical power of consciousness visionarily upon the natural cycle of things makes something that nature never made. Nature never made pyramids. But when one goes into that visionary, magic form of the pyramid, like the Pyramid of Unas, about 2400 BC, one sees on the walls, the interior walls of the tomb, the hieroglyphs. And the hieroglyphs lead one into the tomb. And as one goes through the portals and the various chambers and comes to the very center of the interior process, there is the sarcophagus. So that the earlier book was the scroll, and earlier than the scroll was the interior of the tomb. And the interior of the tomb, such a venerable form of Paleolithic book, that it survived intact through various vicissitudes, some ages disappearing, some ages coming back. But because there was no advance, there was no capability of getting to the level of scroll, much less book, that one can find that the earliest examples of a hieroglyphic tomb come from places like Lascaux in southern France that are about 18,000 years old. So the earliest Paleolithic caves, even earlier than Lascaux, they go back to about 25,000 BC. So that the cave transformed into a symbolic, magical, visionary tomb by the introduction of written language in a double vector sequence leading to not only culmination, but leading to a transformation point, a transformation node. The transformation node was the place where the body and the mind disappear into a beyond. Symbolically, I flicked the microphone here so it would come across, I guess, on the tape. The body has the ability to interiorize itself through language so that the body disappears into the mind. And in a like ways, the mind has a way of interiorizing into itself so that it disappears into some beyond. Now, the body that disappears into the mind and the mind that disappears into its beyond is the beginning of consciousness. The consciousness is like an energy resonance of whatever it was that the mind disappeared into upon itself. We're concerned now with ritual. We have our hands full. As you can see, if you get into the large scope of what's going on, it gets very difficult. So we're limiting ourselves by talking in sequence about the most fundamental stages so that we will not talk about the transformation of Paleolithic cave temples into books until the end of this year, till we get to symbols. It goes right over everyone's head. What is that profound significance that a Paleolithic cave sanctuary becomes a book? And that one characterizes people who are conscious about God as people of the book? Whoa. There's a lot to say. Whereas if we gradually build up the tolerance and the sensitivity through this education, by the end of the year, we'll be able to hear that kind of language. We'll be able to appreciate what it is that's going on. And that ability to hear, that quality of appreciation will come together in an insight about what's going on in our lives. It doesn't matter what kind of life you're living or what's going on, this focus is of benefit to us, both practically and theoretically, in both theory and practice. The wholeness of the health of our lives is improved immensely by having an appreciation and a grasp of what all of this amounts to. So now the easiest way is just to relax back and realize today is just Ritual 10, and we're just talking about one aspect of a pair of books. We're not using a single book, but we're fudging against the new millennium by using books in pairs. because pairedness characterizes existence. And its further resonance, the other vector, not only characterizes existence, but characterizes existence in its substance and the mind in its essence. That substance and essence, body and mind, can be characterized by the technique of using a pair of books to focus our language. And by pairing books together, books which were not written together but are brought together in a conscious form. So just like the pyramids were made 4,000 years ago by very smart people, the people who made the pyramids 4,000 years ago, very smart, they understood that if you take a conscious, symbolic, visionary form and hold it up to the natural cycle of events, you are able not only to read what the natural cycle of events really is, but look through them, behind them, into them, to see the secret hidden agendas that are there also. Because the body only shows the exterior events, it takes the mind to see the interior events. The invisible vector is there by virtue of the mind understanding what's going on, whereas the exterior is only understandable if the body is wise about its vector, its alignments of existence. So the body has a kind of an intelligence quite distinctly different from the mind's intelligence, and these two intelligences are bridged by language. And so language becomes a concern because one wants to have a full kind of language that is able to bridge all of the capacities of the body and all of the capacities of the mind. That language is extremely important. It's the mythic horizon. And after we finish our study of ritual in 2 more weeks, we're going to spend 3 months, 12 weeks on myth, on mythic language, as the bridge between body and mind, as the bridge between ritual and symbol. But even looking ahead, next year, at the beginning of next year, we need to look at the transformation of mythic language into magical language, into visionary language. Because as mythic language bridges the body and the mind, magic language bridges the mind with something objectively beyond the mind, known colloquially as the person, but perhaps more accurately said as the mysterious person, because all persons are mysterious. Because all persons mysteriously have not only the physical body, but they have the invisible mind, not just brought together as a pair, but transformed, tied into a bow. And most of the difficulties that occur in conscious life are because instead of tying a bow, one doesn't understand what one's doing and one ties a knot. And if you know anything about good knots, the more you tug at them, the tighter the knots become. So that the neurotic syndrome of the stupidity of lives that don't work actually are knots. Where there should be a personality, instead there's a confusion. And no wonder people throw up their hands. They leave the confusion behind and return back to something very simple, as in an identity based upon simple actions. I can handle this, but I can't handle what I became. The mathematical definition of a knot is a one-dimensional vector that turns in upon itself without ever touching its context. Now, relationality, where you touch the context, is what the whole purpose of a pattern is. And a transformation that doesn't touch its context whatsoever, instead of becoming a bow, becomes a knot. A one-dimensional, self-avoiding vector is what a knot is, mathematically. All of this kind of language is very powerful. Extremely powerful. We're not ready to talk or to hear on this level yet, so we should be content just to come back off a little bit, and come back to our pair of books in Ritual 10, and trust that if you keep coming Saturday after Saturday after Saturday, month after month, that the alignments will set themselves up because you have a trustworthy guide who's done this lots of times before. That while this seems like wilderness to you, to me it's like friendly mountains. Know all the goat trails. Can even, heaven forbid on bodily level, but on visionary level can fly like great owl. Easy. Big canyon, swoop. No problem. Whereas on individual reductive bodily level, I cling to the soil. Geez, you know how deep that is. But in this mode, fearless. Our pair of books, on one hand, Basho, who deals with haiku, a form of language. On the other hand, the book by Jesse L. Weston, From Ritual to Romance, that concerns the Holy Grail. So we're dealing with two aspects, two books that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, haiku and the Grail. How can the haiku and the Grail have anything to do with each other? Normally, they would have nothing to do with each other. But as soon as we begin to think a little bit, put some context on, we begin to get some insight, some inclination that maybe there is some sense here. For one thing, Basho is from the east and the Holy Grail is from the west. So we have something east and west. So if you're talking about 21st century and the next millennium, or even the next 2,000 years being a whole planetary history, if we're going to have a planetary education, if we're going to have planet-sized people, they have to understand both East and West equally. If you don't understand East and West equally, if you're not as at home in French literature as in Japanese literature, how are you going to be planetary? You're going to be provincial and left behind. Most of the Romans did not use books. They still used scrolls, even into the 2nd century AD. They didn't get that there was a change. And likewise, for the next 100 years or so, there'll still be people who are clogged up by a kind of an ethnocentric quality that at one time was commendable and at now the future time is not very commendable. And in order to move beyond this kind of parochial sand trap quality, one has to understand that there are ways to do this. There are techniques, but that the techniques have something to do with the strategy of an overall situation. And that the essence of a strategy of an overall situation can be symbolized as a journey. In Gawain, it's called the quest. In Basho, the narrow road to the deep north, it's called a Zen travelogue. So the Zen travelogue and the quest, the Grail quest, and the Zen travelogue, where the haiku is the most important punctuation, have a lot in common. So it's not only East and West as different, but it's East and West as resonant. One can compare Basho's journeys with the Grail quest, and one can find that in Basho, his Zen journeys are a direct development of previous kinds of journeys. That Zen has a history, a development. Before there was a Japanese Zen, there was a Chinese Zen. And that Chinese Zen perfected itself in the landscape scroll, which was a Chinese Zen kind of traveling. I have one behind me. It's an original, by the way, done in the 20th century. Very good, very excellent. The Chinese landscape scroll was the Chinese Zen journey travelogue. In the same way, the Western Grail quest, when it became really heavily symbolic, one finds the great symbolic scrolls that contain the entire alchemical transformation journey of the Grail quest in a single scroll. One of the most famous of these scrolls, done by a man named Ripley, George Ripley, in the 14th century in England. Don't worry about being old-fashioned. 14th century England was very wise. Chaucer's day. There's nothing stupid about Chaucer. He understood perfectly well. He didn't have computers, but there were men and women, and Chaucer understood men and women very well. When one looks at the Ripley scroll, which is about 15 feet long, there are two copies of the Ripley scroll in Los Angeles. One is at the Philosophic Research Society that Manly Hall bought in the early 1920s. I think the King of Sweden put up money to buy it. The other is in the Huntington Library, outside of the director's office. And one sees on the Ripley scroll all of the beautiful alchemical journey of the Grail quest in one single scroll, and it looks remarkably like a Chinese landscape scroll in terms of its symbolic organization and its visionary conscious presentation. And no wonder, because there was a tremendous interchange at that time. That East and West had a tremendous interchange briefly there, not in the 1300s, but in the 1200s, even in the 1100s. Why was there such an interchange? Because the West got the idea at the end of the 1000s to go on a crusade, to go and retake the Holy Land. And the Holy Land was in Eastern hands. And for 300 years, through 8 crusades, the East and West fought each other and had all kinds of secret interchanges. Out of that came adventurous journeyers like Marco Polo, that went from Venice to Beijing and back. So that there was a tremendous interchange on a planetary scale of East and West at that time. And one not only has the Ripley scroll in medieval England, but one has something like the Cloud of Unknowing in medieval England. The Cloud of Unknowing is an English Upanishad. It's written exactly with the same meditative tone that the Upanishads are written in ancient India. So there have been times of great interchange. In 1900 BC, the world was international. In 1900 BC, East and West flowed in between each other in a most amazing and surprising manner. Because right at the center of it, the great development of the Sumerian civilization in the time of Sargon of Akkad, he established for the very first time links between India and Samaria and Egypt, so that all three were linked together by caravan routes. And the greatest of all the caravan routes was on the left hand of that great double arch, the right hand being from India to Samaria through ancient Iran, and on the left hand being from Samaria to Egypt. And that caravan route from Samaria to Egypt arced up and over and down. And at the top of the arc was a city named Haran. A very, very famous city. And in a moment you'll understand why. Even we today can understand why. So that in the time of Sargon of Akkad, the world was international. Ideas and commerce flowed everywhere from the Atlantic Ocean to the Bay of Bengal. And at the very center of the whole thing was this point at the upper arch of the left-hand arch of the great caravan routes, Haran. And Haran is where a man named Terah lived. And he owned the animals that were used on that caravan route. There were no camels at that time. The domestication of the camel had not occurred yet. The animal that they used was a black-haired donkey, a black-haired jackass. Black-haired mules that were very tough could go on that desert, could go on that caravan. And now Terah was very old by the time he amassed this huge caravan route by virtue of having a monopoly on the animals that were able to carry it. So it was his son that gets all the credit. And his son was named Abram. And so the first patriarch of the Jews gained his wealth because he owned the animals that made the caravan route that linked these two civilizations together. Now, Haran belonged specifically and exactly to the military and economic province of whoever ran Samaria or Akkad or Babylonia, whatever it was called. Today it's called Iraq. But a little further over that route was a land, a no man's land that wasn't quite owned by Egypt, wasn't quite owned by Samaria, and that land was only owned by people that were much less powerful, the Canaanites. It was called Palestine. And so Abraham, being a smart businessman, located his business exactly there in Canaan, in Palestine, and bought several sections of it, paid a lot of money at the time. Bought Mount Gerizim so that the sacrifices could be made at the top of Mount Gerizim. Bought a place down below, a crossroads where there was a well, which is the well where the episode of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery happened, very symbolic. And he bought another well, Rachel's well, that was at the crossroads in between two places that came hundreds of years later, called Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And he bought spots for tombs to bury. So he bought wells and tombs and a mountain peak so that he would have a place to do the basic functions that he needed to keep his vision alive. And so Israel is where it is today because of 4,000 years of this kind of visionary architecture of landscape, which itself, great as it is a subset of the whole development of civilization, which is tens of thousands of years old, of which this education is the future presentation of the wisdom that made all those things run. Why were they real? Because they were not only practical, they were theoretically exact. They not only worked, but they held together in meaning. And this education presents not only the practical and the theory, but the whole transformation to the consciousness of two other realms, the person and the cosmos, without which none of it becomes capable of civilization. Because vision is the beginning of a whole other process, the process of consciousness, that sustains the objectivity of persons and the objectivity of the cosmos. So even if one masters the body and the mind, that's only for openers. A mythic language, powerful as it is, that links body and mind together, is not even in the running to make the great kinds of languages that are needed to make conscious civilizations. Even conscious civilizations that spread from Egypt to Sumeria to India. Whereas in a couple of hundred years, the spread of civilization will be the entire star system. This planet and all 8 planets of this sun and all of the moons, the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud, it'll be a full light year across. That's the scale of civilization that this education is about. It has nothing to do with the level of scroll learning or of cave sanctuaries or even of books. Nothing to do whatsoever, except that it remembers all of those stages accurately so as to allow for a real transformation to something new that's never been seen. Never been seen because there have never been people capable of seeing it. So this is a new kind of jewel. It's a kind of a jewel that has never been cut before. And yet it's the kind of jewel that when you hold it up to the energies of life will work like a laser through it and make coherence that's hardly even imaginable beforehand. Let's come back to Ritual 10. We have our hands full with Ritual 10. We have a pair of books, one on haiku and one on the Grail. Let's look at haiku for just a moment, then we're going to take a break. How much time do we have? We have a few minutes? We have 5 minutes. 2 or 3 minutes. Let's look at one salient thing, and then we'll take the break. One salient thing about basho, about haiku. The Chinese landscape scroll was a journey which one took by reading it. You had to put yourself into that landscape scroll and take that journey imaginatively. With the Zen travelogue, like the Narrow Road to the Deep North, Basho was extraordinarily capable. He did not want us to take the journey imaginatively, but realistically. So his concern was not with aesthetics so much as with reality. Later on, there were other haiku poets. The next greatest haiku poet after Basho is Busan, lived about 100 years later, lived in the next century. Basho in the 1600s, Busan in the 1700s. Basho always concerned himself with keeping in balance substance and essence as a pair. It was the key to his whole structure of his poetry, of his travelogues. Whereas others at the time shifted over into ingenious versions of metaphor. Now, however much one admires metaphor and variety, the ingeniousness of metaphor, if not handled artistically, becomes a baffle to the pre-transformation proto-person. If you do not have an artistic education If your education is not raised to the level of appreciating metaphor, metaphors are confusing. And this is what happened to haiku at the time of Basho. Almost all of the haiku, almost all of the Japanese poetry at the time was in a state of ingenious, confusing dilettantism. Basho alone weaned himself away from this. And in weaning himself away from that confused world, came to discover something poignant. And when he did, his Zen travelogues recorded this sudden, rapid discovery, because all of Basho's Zen travelogues were written in a 10-year period. It's just like all of Van Gogh's paintings were made in a 10-year period. One looks at the tremendous titanic achievement of Van Gogh, and you see it was not the occurrence of a lifetime of work, but one single decade. Like Greta Garbo, all her great films were made in one single decade. It's just incredible. The same way with Basho. All of his Zen travelogues are made in one single decade. Because there was a transformational node. There was a point at which the resistance to understanding suddenly gave way, and a burst of insight, a realization of what one was doing, so that the capacity to do it was suddenly given a wind at one's back. And instead of resistance hindering you, the same powers that hinder you, if you transform and go on the other side of them, they help you. Have you never heard, do not kill what is holding you back, because that same energy will be a helper later on. But you have to make the penetration, the transformation. And so you have to work with resistance, not to exit out. If you take a pill and X out the resistance, you get dependent on the pills. Whereas if you learn how to penetrate through, the resistances then become friends. They become helpers. They become companions. The very thing that seemed to be demons now become angels. But one has to have that penetrative capacity. And we'll talk more about that when we come back from the break. Some time ago, about 30 years ago, Japan Airlines held a haiku contest in the United States. And they received over 50,000 entries. They were absolutely stunned by it. The Japan Society in the United States, in preparation for that haiku contest, put out a little pamphlet called Haiku in English by Harold G. Henderson. And they made it free just for the asking. All you had to do was write to Japan Airlines. They would mail you this 45, 50-page booklet. And so many copies of that were passed out that finally Tuttle Publishing took it up. And it's now available in a little Tuttle paperback, still available. The tremendous response to haiku took everyone by surprise, mainly because it was always considered as the archetypal Japanese poetry art form, and they had no idea that Americans would have a response, would have an appreciation, would have an interest in haiku. What everyone had overlooked was the fact that a great population of people had been sensitized, not so much to haiku, but to the Japanese orientation to traveling that is the context in which haiku can really be appreciated. And that was because of the Beat Generation writers, especially like Jack Kerouac, On the Road, and the huge population of people that read Kerouac's On the Road and many other versions of that kind of beat journey prepared the kind of appreciation that is required for haiku. Because in a way, the Japanese haiku reaches its artistic pinnacle in the Zen travelogues of Basho. And in an odd way, as soon as there is an artistic objectifying of a form, wherever that form has its appeal, has its resonance, all of the context, all of the relationalities that went into making that artistic form are also activated. It's like every level of objectivity, as it occurs, incorporates all of the energies before it into something operative. Ritual incorporates all the energies of nature into processes of existence focused on the body, which are very exacting. Symbols integrate in the mind all of the energies that have gone before it, not only the energies of nature and those of ritual, but also those of language, those of myth. Art incorporates the energies of vision and magic and consciousness and differentiation, as well as all of the energies of the natural cycle. And just so, in culmination, the cosmos incorporates in its objectivity all of the energies of nature, all of the energies of art, as well as the energies of history. So that as you move up, there are 4 stages, 4 steps of objectivity: ritual, symbol, art, and the 4th level of objectivity, the cosmos, we would understand today as science. Science is objective. Science is as objective and as exact as ritual is. But it's difficult for us to appreciate that the exactness of science, the exactness of ritual, are also exact for symbols. That symbols are precise to almost an embarrassing extent. I think it was Emerson who once said, "Symbols do not inhabit us, we inhabit symbols." But perhaps the most difficult objectivity to appreciate of all, is art, that art is objective. And it's not just because of a deficient aesthetic in our age, in our generation, our time, which certainly there is. Most surely, aesthetics is very crimped and inarticulate at this particular time, or this generation. But the objectivity of art is intimately linked to the objectivity of the person. And the difficulty of achieving personal objectivity is completely hindered by the resistances that are set up by the misappropriation and the misapproximations of identities, of egos, even to the extent that I have had students who have gone through a couple of cycles of this when it comes to something new, something differentially unknown that comes into personal objectivity, their egos get in the way and there's not only no acceptance but no appreciation of the viability, of the freedom, of the variety of the person. Put in a very simple expression, Walt Whitman once, in the very first page of his little book called Democratic Vistas, written in the 1870s, trying to pull the vision of the United States back together. Whitman, at the beginning of Democratic Vistas, said, "Nature seems to respect 2 things equally, freedom and variability. And that if we wish to have a democratic society, we must have the democratic person first. And that democratic persons must appreciate freedom and variability, at least on an extent, with the broadness of nature. So that the whole basis of the health of a democratic people is based on the health of a democratic personality, which is at least as broad in tolerance as the cycles of nature. This kind of understanding, even though it was written 125 years ago, is still of use to us, still important for us to be reminded, or perhaps deeper than reminding. What is deeper than reminding? Recognition. To recognize that there are these qualities. At first glance, haiku seemed to mitigate against freedom and variety, because the haiku has the strictest of all forms. It's reduced down seemingly to the smallest poetic form on the planet. That it has only 17 syllables, and that those syllables arrange themselves in 3 distinct phases of 5, 7, 5. And one would think with that kind of curtailing, that kind of rigidity, that freedom and variety would be mitigated against from the get-go. Whereas in fact, when one has a symbolic precision, a symbolic exactness, linking it with the exactness of ritual existence, so that symbolic essence and ritual substance are linked together in alignment, the exact symbolic form delivers the variety and freedom, which then characterizes the conscious vision that is the field in which person occurs. The person is like a prism suspended in midair in an energy field of consciousness, which is made up of differential vision, which is floated by the incredible pyrotechnics capable of a magic language. A fairy tale is a magic language form, and fairy tales are radically different from myths, as we will see. And that fairy tales can not only be cute little nursery things, but they can be fabulously large, epic-sized undertakings, like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is one great fairy tale. It's a magic language which has a tremendous capability within it. For only those who could speak a magic language would have the courage of heart, mind, and spirit to dare objectify a person. Otherwise, the dangers of the unknown are too great, and one would never dare to be. One of the most poignant books that came in an earlier generation, in the 1920s, 1930s generation, was by Paul Tillich, and the title of the book was The Courage to Be. It's difficult enough on the ritual level to be, in face of all the dangers and vicissitudes of nature, but it's far more asymptotically dangerous to be a person, objectively, in a dangerous realm that includes not only the vicissitudes of nature, but the vicissitudes of language, the dangers of language, of the whole mythic ocean, plus the dangers and vicissitudes of consciousness. So the person is triply courageous. The person is courageous in face of all of the movement and variety and freedom and wildness of nature, and the oceanic perils of language, and the great swirls of the unknown fields of consciousness. And so the person is always a triply courageous being. We're concerned now with just the first elementary level, the ritual level, where the courage to be is the courage to achieve definiteness of existence. And the definiteness of existence is precarious vis-a-vis the reality of nature. For nature in no way is ever just exactly what it is. It's always in motion. It's always in change. It's always in relationality. So all rituals have an existential wiseness about them. And the wiseness is to keep the ritual form as accurate as can be, because the application of the exact ritual form is always different every time it's used. While the form is kept exact, the application, if one is attentive, is always to a different circumstance. And the most beautifully simple way of showing the different circumstance is to put an exact ritual form into play in a journey which almost symbolically presents the changing vicissitudes of nature. And in Basho's Narrow Road to the Deep North, he presents us on many different levels with the courage to be, both as an artist, on the art level as a person, and on the symbolic level, the courage to be objectively there in terms of the mind. But for us, what we're concerned now is the courage for his existence to happen. For his very name, Basho, was taken later in life. When he was born, he was named Kinsaku. And when he got to be a young man, they called him Toshichiro, or sometimes Chuemin. And when he first began to write, his name was Sobo. And after a while, he took a name Tose. But it was only in 1680, when he was in his late 30s, that he assumed the name Basho. Basho means banana plant. Friends of his had taken this little provincial young man, he was from Ueno, U-E-N-O, Ueno, down in the more southern regions of Japan, down near the old Japanese capital, the ancient capital, Nara. About on the same latitude as one would find Kyoto or Lake Biwa. Ueno was a little provincial place. And Basho grew up there in this very limited world. And when he came of age, he had studied haiku, he had studied writing in connection with a young nobleman's son. And when the young nobleman's son died, very young, in his young manhood, Basho asked to be released from the burden of studying the writing language. It reminded him too much of what had happened. When he was refused to do this, he ran away. He ran away to Kyoto. And for 5 years, Basho lived a curious double life. He lived a life of kind of young man bohemian openness, but at the same time, he intensified his study of writing, because the school teacher that had come to Ueno to teach the two young men actually lived in a monastery, in a Zen monastery in Kyoto. And so while by day, as it were, Basho was living this kind of carefree bohemian life, probably with a young lady, at night Basho was in a Zen monastery learning even more exact use of language, a Zen-like use of language. And after 5 years of this, Basho came back to Ueno, and he was no longer known by the names that his family had given him, Kinsaku or Choimin, but he had taken the name Sobo. And he only stayed for a few months in Ueno because he had overgrown it so much. Later on in his life, Basho, when he moved into a new house, he said he sat in the new house like a huge old oak out of place. That he had become enlarged to such an extent that he no longer fit, not only in the old provincial city, village of Ueno, but he no longer fit into that whole life pattern. So he went away this time, not running away, but walked away and went not to Kyoto, but went to the largest, most dynamic place in Japan, Edo, which later became Tokyo. And when he went to Edo, he began to publish his writings and became known as a fabulous poet. In those days, there was no haiku as we would know it classically today because Basho made that form. The Japanese poetry of ancient times, back in the 700s to the 1100s, that period is known as the Heian period. And in that period, there was this technique of using a poetic form called the waka, which had 31 syllables. And the waka was a short, descriptive, emotional poem. And in that period, in the Heian period, there was the beginning of the technique where two poets would come together and they would split a waka between them. One would write the first 17 syllables and the next would write the next 14 syllables, making the waka of 31 syllables. So the first poet would write what became the haiku when it was abstracted. And the response was from the second poet, who would write the 2 lines, 7-7, that would go with the 5-7-5. And then in the next period, the Kamakura period, they found that one of the seeds of this exchange between two poets, one writing the first part of the waka and the other the second part, that you could have many poets together, all writing alternating sections so that you would link them together. So it was then called not waka, but renga, means linked verse. It means a chain, a poem chain, where you could have indefinite. In the Kamakura period, sometimes there would be more than 100 poets that would get together, and each would write a part. Or there would be maybe a dozen poets, and each would write maybe 5 or 6 parts. So long chains of linked verse, renga, occurred in the Kamakura period. Then there came this development of Japanese history where the clever exchanges of the Kamakura period were frowned upon. Japan went through a series of very violent wars, Kurosawa type stuff. And in the Muromachi period, a great somber seriousness came upon Japan. And what was looked upon as stupidity. And in the Muromachi period, the linked verse became this kind of limited, serious insight into the dangerous nature of human life. But in the following period, the period in which Basho came, a period called the Edo period that started in the early 1600s and went all the way up until the late 1800s. The Edo period. There was a return back to a balance where the seriousness and the wit of poetry were brought together so that the seriousness mitigated wit into delightful insight, and the wit mitigated the seriousness into penetrative insight. So there was like a realistic insight paired with a delightful quality. And in this Edo period, the genius was Basho, who had been Sobo, but when he moved to Edo, a number of his friends got together and bought him a little hut on the Sumida River, on the isolated outskirts of Edo. And in order to commemorate the place, they planted a banana plant there. And Basho, living with that banana plant, said that he came to appreciate the frail, slender qualities of the banana plant that frayed under all conditions and never broke, never died. He said when it was fresh and new, the leaves were like great, huge fans that would catch the wind or catch the sound of the spatter of rain or catch the glint of the sun. And when they would begin to tear a little bit, the banana fronds looked like the tail of fabulous phoenixes. And when they would get really battered by the wind and the weather and start to crumple even more, that they had this kind of eerie quality, especially in the moonlight, of their shapes. And so Basho was born out of this deepening insight into the fact that poetry has not only a polarity of wit and serious, but that the seriousness and the wit, when they come together, they exchange and they transform and they produce three separate qualities that have a relationship together. One of the qualities is a deep appreciation for the loneliness, that loneliness is not bad. It's not the perilous disgustingness that seriousness would make out of, that one would do anything not to be lonely. It's not loneliness in the serious mode, but it's lonely solitude in the realistic mode. And it's not loneliness in the witty mode that, oh, I'm alone tonight, who can I call? Not that kind of loneliness, but the lonely solitude that Basho began to hone as an emotional tone into his poetry. In Japanese, it's called sabi. It means the lonely solitude, like someone like Thoreau, who would stand in a forest in a snowstorm to be with the trees while it snowed. That kind of lonely solitude. And related to that was a quality which is called in Japanese hosumi. Hosumi, it means slenderness. That how slender can you get and still have it what it is? That hosumi is this slenderness. It's not a slenderness that breaks, but it's a slenderness that endures, even though it might be crimped, it might be bruised, it might be maimed, yet it endures. And so one has this hosomi, one has also this quality of sabi, and then there's a quality that goes along with slenderness and the lonely solitude. It's a quality that translates as tenderness. Perhaps tenderness is not quite right for the 1990s. We would call it sensitivity. Tenderness in the sense of being sensitive to nuance, of allowing for impressions to really occur in all of their delicateness, the openness to allow for what used to be called tenderness, that sensitivity can be as fine as it needs to be, and that there's no jeopardy, there's no danger in being as sensitive as nuance needs to be. So slenderness, tenderness, lonely solitude, these are the characteristics of poetry that Basho began to imbue at the time, which were new. And as he did this, he realized that the activity of life that most clearly exemplifies lonely solitude, this tenderness, the sensitivity to nuance, and this slenderness, was to take a journey and make a record of the journey, both in prose and in poetry. A prose as the body of the movement of the journey, and the poetry as the moments of insight during that prose movement. So that his first travelogue was entitled Travels of a Weathered Skeleton. A weathered skeleton. It's the very essence and yet still a substance. The skeleton of oneself. The ancient technique, the shamanic technique of turning oneself inside out. The ancient Paleolithic image of transformation, that you were turned inside out, was that the shaman wore the skeleton, the bones, on the outside of the body. And what Basho is saying in his shamanic way, that these are the travels of a weathered skeleton, someone who's been turned inside out for a long time and has gone a long ways. Remember Indiana Jones saying, it's not the years, it's the mileage? So Basho's mileage was ancient. And so Travels of a Weathered Skeleton, a weather-worn skeleton, was his first journey. And when he came back from this and wrote this up and published this, he got an insight. And in order to fix the insight, he took a very short, not a journey, but a visit. A short journey is like a visit to a shrine in Karashina. And he entitled it A Visit to Karashina Shrine. And there was this kind of terse aspect. So in a way, the Travels of a Weather-Worn Skeleton is like a long journey, Visit to Karashina Shrine like a short journey. It was like the prose and the haiku in the forms of the travelogues. And when he understood what it was that he was doing, he decided to take a third journey, and in this third journey to produce the long and short at the same time. 2 journals at the same time. The short one would take place within the longer one, but would be separate from it. It's a similar technique that was spontaneously found by one of the greatest of all 20th century poets, Rilke. After 10 years of silence, of not being able to write anything because of the First World War, just scrambling the poetic psyche of the German language mind, a silence that not only stopped up Rilke, but stopped up Hesse and Jung and many people who had a German language mind at that time. After 10 years of silence, Rilke found his voice again on the shores of the Adriatic Sea, in a castle far up on a bluff, the Duino Castle, where he wrote the great Duino Elegies. And in the midst of writing the Duino Elegies, all of a sudden came the Sonnets of Orpheus, right in the middle of it. Rilke said that it was he as a poet who wrote the Duino Elegies, but it was the spirit of poetry that through him spoke the Sonnets to Orpheus. And so the Sonnets of Orpheus fits into the Duino elegies. Rilke once said it was like a great white sail against which a brilliant orange burnt sienna sail. Two ships on the same sea, but one a fast craft of the spirit, the other the great elegant craft of the whole ship. In this same way, Basho's genius saw the visit this time was to a Sarashina village instead of to a shrine to a village. And the travel log, the larger one, was called Travels of a Travel-Worn Satchel. Sometimes the word travels is translated as records of a travel-worn satchel. Notice here, it's the person has become invisible, has been transmuted into invisibility. The skeleton was the person reduced to the inner, now become outer, but when the skeleton disappears even further, one has just the satchel. Just Claude Rains as the invisible man carrying the satchel around. So Basho, when he finished this third journey, where he put the two together, came back to his place with the banana plant on the river Samita, and he had a tremendous deep insight, one of the world's greatest of all insights, that one could bring not only these two aspects, the short and the long, not only the prose and the haiku, one could bring these two aspects in perfection, face to face, and if they were polished, one would have almost a situation like two mirrors facing each other. A little mirror and a big mirror. And what would you see? You would see complete openness. There would be nothing there. It would be just reflection, reflecting, reflection. And then Basho had the great insight of the Chinese founder of Chinese Zen, the sixth patriarch, Hui Neg, who 1,000 years before Basho wrote a poem about how mirrors are deceptive in Zen. You remember we talked about that story? Talked about the founding of Zen in China by the sixth patriarch, Huineg, who was the little kitchen boy in a monastery where the head honcho monk thought he was a big cheese, and he wrote this beautiful polished poem because it was in poetic language that one shows if one is masterful of consciousness. Only someone who can speak spontaneously on level of poetry is the proof of achievement. Only the spontaneous poet is to be trusted. Before St. Francis was famous for his poverty, he was famous for his poetry. Just as Huineg had read the poem by the head honcho monk, which said, if the mind is polished with no dust on it, then you have an accurate reflection of true nature. Whereas Huineg wrote a little short poem saying, there is no mirror in the mind. Where is there anything to collect dust in the first place? And so Basho, 1,000 years later, sitting in his little hut by the Samita River, under the frayed banana plant, had this insight into a Zen travelogue that would forever change Japan, just as Huineg had forever changed China. Before Huineg, Zen, or Chan, as it was called in China, was Indian Buddhism. Buddhism was always imported from India. And with Huineg, for the first time, you had a native-born Chinese Buddhist master. Buddhism became Chinese with Huineg, and it never again was imported from India. Ever after, Zen masters in China were always Chinese. And so in Basho, one has the occurrence of a Japanese Zen master, after which all Japanese Zen masters are Japanese. Before that, Zen masters were always imported from China. Just like the Chinese had always imported them from India. With Huineg, the Chinese became indigenously enlightened. With Basho, the Japanese became indigenously enlightened. They got it not in translation from anybody else, but in terms of their own language. And once done, it was done forever for everybody. All Japanese could read Basho and get him. It is a quality where the very essence of personality becomes constellated by that language to a point of perfection. But Basho did not want to have just some metaphorical bridge between the essence of the symbol and the substance of the ritual. He didn't just want to have a pair of mirrors facing each other. He wanted to have an ongoing presence that, as it occurs, alternately expresses itself as prose and then as the haiku. And so the narrow road to the deep north is that final great Zen travelogue, and this is how it begins in English translation. Days and months are travelers of eternity, and so are the years that pass by. Those who steer a boat across the sea or drive a horse over the earth till they succumb to the weight of years spend every minute of their lives traveling. There are a great number of ancients, too, who died on the road. I myself have been tempted for a long time by the cloud-moving wind, filled with a strong desire to wander. More next week. Thank you.